Welcome to another edition of the Taking Down Trump podcast. I'm Tristan Snell. This week, we're thrilled to welcome YouTube legal commentator extraordinaire Leeja Miller to the show. But first, we're going to tackle yet another crazy week of news, why Republicans are so weird, and exactly what Donald Trump may or may not have been doing when he's been cosplaying as a head of state, running around meeting other heads of state, and whether or not that might be illegal. First, let's talk about the craziest stories from law and politics in the past week. So this week, we had a lot of different stories, a lot of crazy stuff, a lot of big stories happening right now with all of the action in Venezuela. But here in the U.S., Donald Trump basically promised that if he's elected, there won't be any need for further voting in the future. He literally said this on camera over the weekend. And as we can see from Venezuela, it's fairly easy to put a dictator into power if you just give them more votes or if you let them steal it. It's a lot harder to get them out. And meanwhile, even on a micro level in this election, Donald Trump is not really interested in discourse or anything being a two-way street. It's either his way or the highway, because he's now backing out of having a debate with Kamala Harris. He had committed to a debate with Joe Biden on September 10th on ABC. Now he's backed out of that, whining that it is unfair because the Democrats changed their candidate on him. What that really is, let me decode that for you. What that really means is that Donald Trump is scared that he's going to get his ass kicked on national television, that he thought he could handle Joe Biden, and in that first debate, he did win. But now he realizes that he's got a very different set of circumstances in front of him, and now he's chickening out. And I think that we all need to remind everybody of that at every opportunity we get. And I think that it sounds smart that the Harris campaign is going to have the VP sit there on an empty stage if the network will let her. I think we should turn it into a Harris town hall. And then if she wants to have an empty chair and point to the empty chair, she can. And basically just spend the whole time ripping him apart. I think that sounds like a great idea. As for another very smart thing that we saw this week, obviously there's the big trend line to simply focus on calling Trump and JD Vance weird. That's the word of the week, clearly, weird. So all of the other things that a number of people tweeted variations on this, all of the different things that we've been saying about Trump, those of us who believe in democracy, what have we been saying for the past 9 years? That he is a con man, that he is a criminal, that he is a sexual predator, that he is a fascist, that he is a racist, that he doesn't believe in democracy or the rule of law, and that he might even be a traitor, or at the very least committed gross violations of the Espionage Act, according to federal prosecutors. And yet somehow, it's not like these things didn't land. Obviously they did. But somehow calling them weird, and they get very affronted, very upset. Clearly, we're over the target on this one. They don't want to be called weird because they know they are. And somehow making it something, and I think this is a smart thing. The thing to take away from this is that sometimes giving the nerdy, intelligent answer every time for why we want to do something or why the other side is wrong, it's great to work that in. Okay. But every once in a while, we just have to say these things as plainly as we can. And just calling them weird is resonating. People are like, yeah, they are weird, aren't they? Gosh, they're really, really strange people. And especially if you start to think about it more, think about the rest of the Republicans that are in the national spotlight. Ted Cruz. We've been talking plenty about JD Vance. Marjorie Taylor Greene, yeah, she's pretty weird. Lauren Boebert, super weird. Rick Scott. Ron DeSantis, who we have forgotten existed because he was actually too weird for Republican primary voters, so that didn't work out. You've got Mike Johnson, very strange guy. Mike Pence, not the most unweird person on the planet, shall we say, even though he did finally grudgingly do things that followed the Constitution and has kind of talked about it since, but not really. These are not normal people. And they want power, and they want power over our lives. They want power over what goes on in our bedrooms. They want power over what goes on in our schoolrooms. They want to ban books. They want to indoctrinate our children. They want to return women to the 1800s. They want to return everybody except themselves to the 1800s. Yes, that is not only weird as all of these other things, but calling it weird seems to be landing, so let's keep going. Maybe next we can call them gross, because I think they're also gross. It's gross to actually want power over what goes on in someone's bedroom and be so interested in it. It's gross to be spying on and trying to figure out ways to police people's reading lists. That's just gross and weird. But we can get back to that. Let's talk about some good news for a moment, though. Inflation is continuing to fall. The New York branch of the Federal Reserve just released some updated numbers on what they call underlying inflation, and it is back down to 2%, which is the historical normal level of inflation. This is, as far as economists can tell, only the second time in American history that the government has tried to alleviate inflation without causing a recession. Normally, when the Fed or the executive branch tries to do something about inflation, it causes all sorts of problems with the economy. Not this time. So we actually got the soft landing that we were looking for post the COVID inflation bubble that really appears to be over. Now, does that mean that prices are going to go back down to what they were before COVID? No, that would require what's called deflation. Deflation is very bad. If you have deflation, you're probably in some kind of economic crisis. So it's not something that we should want. As much as people would love for prices to go back to where they were a couple of years ago, I would too. But that's not going to happen, and it shouldn't. If it did, that would be the sign of what would be the economic equivalent of a major medical problem. It would be like ICU time for the economy if we were in deflation. That is normally a very, 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 very bad thing. So we don't want that. But the fact that inflation has come back down to sort of the normal levels of what it would normally be is wonderful. And it also hopefully means that the Fed will not only stop raising interest rates, it will actually start to lower them again, which will be good news for everybody, for homeowners, home buyers, for everybody with their credit cards, etc. It's going to be good news and welcome news for everybody. And guess what? Joe Biden and the administration deserve a certain amount of credit for how that went down. I don't know if anyone's going to give it to them, but they do. Sticking with President Biden, he now actually embraced reforms to the Supreme Court, as well as a constitutional amendment stating that ex-presidents are not immune from prosecution. This is a great thing to have Biden be a convert to this cause. He had kind of danced around the issue in previous iterations. This is on the heels of AOC filing articles of impeachment against Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. We're finally starting to see some action, though I will again say not from the Senate Judiciary Committee, which actually has a lot of power to do something about this. Try some subpoenas. We're finally starting to see some action on this. We're finally starting to see somebody do something about the massive corruption and extremism on our Supreme Court. Okay, now, what's going to actually happen here? Is any of this going to pass? Obviously not with a Republican Congress. Then, of course, we have to worry about the filibuster in the Senate. But these are things that the American people very much want to have happen. Term limits for the court, a binding ethics code like everybody else in the government has. Literally everybody else in the government, not just at the federal level, we're talking at the state, local, county, township, whatever, village. Everybody's got a code of ethics for their public employees. Everybody except the Supreme Court. So you can have Clarence Thomas take $4 million in secret, unreported gifts for a couple of decades, and nothing is happening to him. Nothing. Except, yes, the articles of impeachment, which sadly are probably not going to go anywhere for right now, but it was still the principle of the thing. I think that one of the other things that we should be doing, though, is a power that Congress has not really been embracing that it has. Congress, under the Constitution, has the ability to draw the exact lines of what the Supreme Court's jurisdiction is. In other words, what is the Supreme Court allowed to decide cases about? Those boundary lines of what is and is not in the court's jurisdiction is something that Congress has control over. It's something we take for granted because generally speaking, those lines were drawn decades, centuries ago in some instances, and they have not been redrawn. Congress needs to, especially with a new Congress that's hopefully with Democratic majorities by January, they need to look each other in the eye and realize the power that they have. They could, without a constitutional amendment, simply state to the U.S. Supreme Court, you no longer have jurisdiction over the immunity of ex-presidents. They could do it about other things too. They could say you no longer have jurisdiction regarding anything having to do with your own ethics or your own terms of office or your own terms of removal via impeachment. You were never allowed to decide any cases along those lines. They could do that. They could do it tomorrow. They're not going to do it tomorrow, but they could do it in January, and they should. It is a weapon that's just sitting there, dusty and rusting, and not being used. Like a lot of these things. It's amazing. We're going to get to another one of those in a minute when we talk about the Logan Act. Finally, back to New York City, where I am here, where the Manhattan DA's office is fiercely resisting Trump's attempts to get presidential immunity from the 34 felony convictions that he suffered a few months ago and for which he is due to be sentenced. The Manhattan DA's office fired back, making it very clear that no, you do not get immunity for an official act. That's what the Supreme Court said the standard now is, that it is not an official act just because you had actually signed some checks or maybe had a meeting regarding paying off a porn star that you banged. Just because that took place in the White House while you were president does not make it an official act. You'd think that we wouldn't actually have to commit pen to paper to argue that in a court of law, but here we are in the wonderful year of 2024. And what's next there is that now this will get decided by Judge Merchan. Hopefully he will rule that Trump is not immune from the charges, that the convictions are not going to be tossed out, and that we will be headed for a sentencing as now scheduled for September 18th, which we seemingly have forgotten about in this summer of other craziness. Donald Trump is due to be sentenced potentially to a prison term in less than 2 months. And it will happen before the election. So this is going to get interesting. Those are just some of the stories I've been covering this week. As always, for the latest, follow me on Twitter, follow and subscribe on my Substack, and you'll always get the latest analysis and news from me. Coming up, a deeper dive into Donald Trump's fake foreign policy summits and a long ago passed law called the Logan Act. For a bit of a longer discussion today, let's talk about Trump running around acting like he's still some sort of head of state and how it actually turns out that's illegal and something that should be prosecuted in addition to Trump's other many, many crimes. Trump has been on another crime wave this year. As a presidential candidate, he has been running around meeting with a whole lot of other heads of state, including Hungary's Viktor Orban and most recently Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, who came for what for all the world looked like a summit down at Mar-a-Lago. Now, just simply doing a photo op with some other head of state is by itself probably benign if it's that in a vacuum, if it's just, hello, we're having a nice chat, blah, blah, blah. But if it goes anything deeper than that, and there's a lot of evidence that with a number of these meetings where they had closed door sessions, where there were Trump staffers and staffers for those particular heads of state all meeting together, we have to ask ourselves the question of whether or not this is a situation of a private U.S. citizen engaging in foreign policy without authorization. That has been illegal in America since, get this, 1799 is when that was made illegal by something called the Logan Act. It has been on the federal books ever since. And spare me now any talk about how, oh, well, if it hasn't been used this whole time or it's that old, then it can't still be any good. And it's like, the Constitution is that old. It dates from 1787. The Bill of Rights dates from 1791. Somehow those things are still okay to say those are good law. But somehow the Logan Act from 1799 isn't passed by Congress, signed by the president. That's no longer good. Just because we didn't use it for some time, it means that it's expired. Law doesn't work that way. Congress actually has to step in and repeal it. Otherwise, it's a court basically putting on the cloak of a legislator and saying this law doesn't count anymore. It doesn't work that way. Okay? Congress actually has to go and repeal it. Until they do so, this law is on the books. Now, what does it say? Let's take a look at the language and then let's determine together whether or not we think it could be applicable here in the Donald Trump situation. So you can find this yourself. Just Google the Logan Act, or it's at 18 USC 953. USC is short for U.S. Code. This is the federal statutory set of laws. It goes, quote, any citizen of the United States, wherever he may be, who, without authority of the United States, directly or indirectly, commences or carries on any correspondence or intercourse with any foreign government or any officer or agent thereof, with intent to influence the measures or conduct of any foreign government or of any officer or agent thereof in relation to any disputes or controversies with the United States, or to defeat the measures of the United States, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 3 years or both. So that's a lot, but let's just unpack it, okay? When we talk about this, there's relatively plain definitions for a lot of these words. This was done in 1799, so correspondence, that would letters, but that could be emails or text messages. We don't know if those are occurring or not. Intercourse, all jokes aside, here we can just replace the word interact or interaction with that there. It's any kind of interaction with a foreign leader or a staffer of that foreign leader, any kind of interaction with a foreign government. To do one of two things, either one, with an intent to influence with regard to some kind of dispute or controversy between that country and the U.S., or to defeat the measures of the U.S. So any kind of dispute or controversy, that doesn't need to be a war. It doesn't need to be any kind of real conflict. It can just be a disagreement, any kind of disagreement regarding foreign policy with that government. Defeat the measures of the U.S. Note that they didn't say here defeat a law or defeat a treaty or anything like that. They could have used those words, but they didn't. Measures is very broad. That just means to defeat the foreign policy measures, the foreign policy goals, the foreign policies of the United States. So let's just apply that to this situation. There are right now differences and policy disagreements between the U.S. and the Netanyahu administration in Israel. Plenty of them. If Donald Trump and or his staffers are having meetings with Netanyahu and his staffers and making promises about what they will or will not do once they get back into office, if they were to get back into office, that is a violation of the Logan Act, because that is trying to influence policy and it is defeating the measures. It's undercutting, it's undermining the Biden administration. It's basically saying, don't pay any attention to the Biden people. We're going to be in there in 6 months and we'll do everything that you're looking to do. Now, were those conversations actually happening? That's where a deeper dive is merited. But for them to have that kind of a policy summit where they're then having what appear to be substantive conversations, right? Where it's not just a quick photo op and one and done. They're not going to get ice cream together, okay? They're sitting down at a table with a whole bunch of staff members. And by the way, this was in Mar-a-Lago. And what's the significance of that? Well, Donald Trump doesn't normally spend a lot of time at Mar-a-Lago in July. Have you ever been to Florida in July? It's very hot and very humid. Donald Trump has multiple houses. He doesn't spend the summer in Florida. He spends the winter in Florida. He spends the summer at his place in Bedminster, New Jersey. Okay. Why wasn't this summit Hell, generally speaking, Trump is just not at Mar-a-Lago at all between May or June and sometime in the fall. Okay, he's not there. The place is basically his part of his residence at Mar-a-Lago is often shut down. We know about all of this because of all of his comings and goings with regard to the documents, right? That's why he was potentially taking, as far as people can tell, boxes of documents potentially with him to Bedminster when he left Mar-a-Lago for the summer, because he wasn't going to be back and he wanted his precious documents with him. Okay. Why was he having this summit with Netanyahu down at Mar-a-Lago in July when he's normally never there? I think that it's because if he had done it at Bedminster, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of New Jersey might well have decided that maybe an investigation of Donald Trump's violations of the Logan Act was merited and would have gone forward with something. Investigations, prosecutions have to be done in the proper venue. They have to occur in the district where the alleged crimes were supposedly occurring. Okay, so if he'd had this summit at Bedminster, then the District of New Jersey would have had dibs over it, effectively. By doing this down in Florida, he draws the Florida federal judges in the Southern District of Florida, and specifically in the West Palm Beach division of the Southern District of Florida, which includes none other than Eileen Cannon. If Jack Smith were to try to investigate or prosecute Donald Trump for this summit with Netanyahu, for example, there is an excellent chance that it would end up lumped together as a related case and stuck before Judge Cannon. So that's why Trump did this, so that he would evade accountability. He would evade justice for this, because there is no good reason that anybody has come up with, that I've heard at all, for why the hell Donald Trump was down at Mar-a-Lago in July when he's never there in July. Donald Trump, I believe, knows that it was illegal. His people were cautious and careful and told him, if you're going to do this, do it, but don't do it in New Jersey. Do it down in Florida. It's safer. Hopefully Judge Cannon can protect us. That is what we're up against when we're talking about the corruption in the judiciary and the problems that we're having bringing Donald Trump to any kind of justice or accountability, or having him in any way not be above the law. And it really looks like there's something there worth investigating. So we need to be taking a much closer look at that, and we need to be applying the laws that are on the damn books. That's what they're there for. If you don't think that law should be there, then get Congress to repeal it. That's what having the rule of law is. Coming up, Leeja Miller on taking down Trump. Next. Next, we're all in for a real treat. Leeja Miller is here. She has quickly become one of the top legal commentators on the internet, particularly on YouTube, where she has over 430,000 subscribers. She has been breaking down and analyzing and explaining and getting passionate about a lot of issues regarding a whole range of things on the legal spectrum, but especially as of late, dealing with the intersection of law and politics. Leeja Miller, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, JD Vance and the Ottoman Empire. JD Vance and you know, dolphins taking over the universe. He might like that a lot. You know, we joke, but there's also like a lot of seriousness under all of this. I think the jokes are landing. And it's actually getting people to then pay attention to the fact that he is not just a strange person, because he is, but also that he's a craven extremist opportunist who will literally do anything to take power and seize it and control it, and to control all of us in the process. I probably have led the witness here, but tell me about JD Vance. What do you think about him? Let's talk about Mr. JD for a few minutes.
Well, as my governor just said, my governor, Tim Walz, here in Minnesota, he's a bit of a weirdo, I think is an accurate description. Yeah. But yeah, I think that there is something sinister under the surface of all of the couch jokes and everything else we can say about him. I saw one meme that said he looks like a racist Care Bear. So
Yep.
the internet culture around the JD Vance jokes, I love, I consume, but yeah, it's really, he's an opportunist, and I'm honestly less afraid of him specifically because he's started his career as a lawmaker a year ago. His credentials aren't there to kind of know what he's doing, but the people behind him are the ones that I think are the sinister piece of it. And his willingness to do and say whatever will get him in their good graces is, I think, also sinister and gives me pause. And just his kind of history of very clearly seeing himself as an outsider and always being aware of his position of away from or closer to the haves and the people that have the power. He clearly has kind of this obsession with fitting in that he'll do anything, and that makes me nervous.
That's an interesting observation. I don't know if I've heard that from anybody else. And it reminds me of, and this is a problem, that was also something people said about Richard Nixon.
Mm-hmm.
And they've long said it about Donald Trump. He made this big show of like sort of invading Manhattan from Brooklyn and Queens, where the Trump family had traditionally done all of their business. He really wanted to fit in Manhattan society, and he never quite made it. And that chip on his shoulder has been a problem for all of us for these number of years. So if JD has the same affliction, that's a problem. Tell us more.
I was just going to say he came from, poverty in Ohio, as he made very obvious in his memoir, and then went to Yale Law School. And I think anyone who's been privy to the legal sphere, the prestige Olympics that come with that. I mean, I didn't go to an Ivy League, but I can only imagine it's even more intense at a place like Yale. I think that's inevitably going to put a chip on your shoulder going to school with, Georgetown prep kids. And, it's just, I don't think he's ever gotten away from that.
And then tell us more about why you think him as a vehicle for other people backing him. Elaborate on that a little bit more for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, Peter Thiel is someone I hadn't even heard of until a couple weeks ago, to be honest, because I don't pay attention to tech billionaires usually because I don't really care what they have to say. But now I do, because he has bankrolled Vance's entire, I was going to say political career, his entire career since they met when he was at Yale. The fact that he got into venture capital because Peter Thiel was like, here's $120 million from me and my friends, go for it. Like, it's very absurd to me. And the fact that JD Vance now owes him his entire career, including his ascension to VP or, VP pick at least, means that he's going to be in Peter Thiel's back pocket. And Peter Thiel has some of the looniest ideas about politics and how society should be run. His views on how basically democracy isn't good for humanity. It's outmoded, as I think Rachel Maddow said. It's at a point. He thinks that everyone would be better off if democracy was done away with, if there was one kind of strong ruler who was able to run the country like a startup company, ignoring the fact that 90% of startups fail. It's the most out of touch thing that clearly would only come from someone who just wants to amass power and hasn't really had to think about the well-being of other people for any of his life now that he's a billionaire. It's scary. And it's fringe and has been laughed off since these ideas came into being. But now they're becoming mainstream, and in a way that now we need to know Peter Thiel's name. We can't just treat him like this random tech billionaire with crazy ideas that'll never happen.
Right. I mean, in other things, he's also really the brains behind the operation for Elon Musk and has been for 25 years. They worked on PayPal together back in the late 90s, and Musk has long been Thiel's more charismatic avatar, basically.
Which is shocking.
Right. And Musk is a weirdo too.
Yeah.
But if you look at video of Thiel, he's even weirder.
Yeah.
So he needs somebody like Musk to be the front man for him. And with Vance, he found someone who's also weird, but less weird than Peter Thiel. But yeah, let's just, a couple of things, a couple other fun facts about Peter Thiel include he believes that it was a mistake to give women the right to vote, and he believes the 19th Amendment to the Constitution should be repealed. He does believe that democracy should effectively be replaced by fascism, by some kind of dictatorship. And he also believes, by the way, he's not really a capitalist either, because he doesn't believe in economic competition. He writes very plainly in probably his best known book is called 0 to 1, which is ostensibly about startups. But if you read it, it's actually about how startups can effectively engage in some very sharp elbowed tactics to achieve monopoly. What he really believes companies should do is to seek a monopoly position where they control 90% or more of a market so that they can dictate to everybody else in the universe exactly how that business is to run. That is his theory of business, is it's not about competition or about offering a good or a service at a fair price and taking care of your customers. No, it's about complete domination. That's what he's really into, is like top-down domination, both for government and for business. It's a very, very scary vision, and it can only be described as fascist and totalitarian.
Right. And I can only assume that it's coming from a place of him thinking that, well, because we're billionaires and we've figured out how to create a business this big, then we deserve this level of control. Clearly, we know what we're doing. So just hand over the reins. Don't worry about it. We got this.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I think Thiel fashions himself to be some sort of, philosopher king, Ubermensch. And, that humanity hasn't had a very good track record of thriving under such people. It hasn't gone well.
They love Viktor Orban. They loved him over in Hungary.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot there to be very scared of, and people should be and educating themselves. I agree with you on exactly what Thiel is up to, and how he's sort of using Vance as his puppet to go do things in the political arena. And then of course we have to talk about Project 2025, which I've already been going into a great deal. I know that you've been looking at that a great deal. What are some of the things about Project 2025 that you've been really thinking about that you don't think are getting enough attention?
Honestly, it's the scale of the organization. So everyone's looking at the words in the 900-page manifesto, which they should be, because those are freaky. But they also have, it's a multiple prong approach. They're also recruiting people. They want people from all walks of life because they're trying to drain the swamp, and they want outsiders. But those outsiders have to be a specific ilk, and they want to bring them in. They have training. They have educational series. I don't know how. I haven't taken the courses, so I don't know how effective they are.
That could be fun. We could sneak into one of those. And
I did sign up on the email list because I was like, let me see what emails they're sending out. And I did get emails inviting me to some different kind of like Zoom calls, but I did not go. So they're recruiting. They're trying to educate people on how to get into office. They are trying to take it over from the inside out, and their blueprint is in their manifesto, but they're executing kind of on all cylinders with this thing, and it's something that they've been doing. I mean, I made a video about it 10 months ago, and people have only been talking about it for the last month, and I don't know what happened that got it finally into like really mainstream talking points, but I'm glad people are talking about it now. But they've been organizing for a year at this point. And I think another important piece that I don't see people talking about enough is this is also based on what the Heritage Foundation made for Reagan back in the 80s.
That's
so this is something they've done before. They didn't just come out of the blue and are just like, hey, what if we tried this? They did it. Reagan only executed about 60% of what they wanted him to, according to them.
Right.
But we're still dealing with the ramifications of that 40 years later. So I think that it's important to know that there could be long-lasting ramifications from this, and that they've done this before. And Reagan ruined everything is a huge talking. I sell T-shirts that say it, and they sell really well. People are still upset about Reagan.
Yeah.
So it's sinister. Yeah.
The Heritage Foundation, for folks who don't know, it has been a far right-wing think tank since I think the 70s. You know, it's definitely part of what we think of today as the modern conservative movement. Has its clearest roots in the 60s with folks who had been part of Goldwater being so far to the right, they got absolutely destroyed, but then they were figuring out, okay, we can't seem to win electoral majorities with our crazy views. How can we do it by other means? And one of the things that they figured out is that can they actually try to take over some of the regulatory agencies from the inside? And one of their biggest projects for this whole time since the 60s has been to take over the judiciary. That's been like a longstanding goal of theirs. If you go back even further, it has its roots back in the 30s opposition to the New Deal. But basically you have a bunch of like, at its core, what you have are a lot of like butthurt millionaires and billionaires who didn't like being, oh no, now I'm not allowed to just rule everything and not be told what to do and actually live within the confines of the society. Wah! And then proceeded to screw everything up for everybody and figure out that like, hey, this democracy thing doesn't seem to be working for us. We need to figure out ways to recapture it effectively. So yeah, that's the thing about Heritage. And then they're going to need to recruit all these people because they don't want any of the current people in bureaucracy, right, to be there. They want to get a whole new cadre of people in there who may or may not know what they're doing. I don't think they care, right? They're not looking for expertise. They're not looking for competence. They're looking for malleability and loyalty, right? Like, I think that's really what they're going for. Finally, last but not least, we turn to the Supreme Court, where we now, of course, have these new reforms that President Biden has embraced. What do you think about this as an additional step forward in the project to do something about the court?
Well, I think it was a good move for Biden to have done because it's incredibly popular with the American public generally. I think that, well, I know that pretty much every Western democracy does something like a term limit or a mandatory retirement age for their justices and even for their congresspeople, but that's a separate conversation. And I think that it would be a messy thing to implement, to figure out, okay, if we have 18-year term limits, what do we do with the current justices? It would take some time to implement, but I think once it got ironed out, it would get rid of a lot of the partisanship because we would know, okay, every 2 years or however many years, I forgot the math, we're going to have a new justice. And so every president gets a certain number of justices that they get to appoint. And we just know that. So it becomes less of a scandal every time it happens. It becomes less of a competition amongst partisans, which that's the whole point of the Supreme Court, is to be above that fray. And they very much have not been. And their term limits based on just serving until they die have gotten much longer. Or retire
prematurely in the case of Anthony Kennedy. Yes.
Right. And those limits have just gotten on average much longer since the 70s, you know, and now we're at a point where I think the average term limit is like 25 or 30 years for justices. And so the partisanship, or the being above the partisanship that I think the writers of the Constitution envisioned, is no longer a thing because people are living beyond 40. And I think it's very necessary. I'm really skeptical about it happening. I mean, Mike Johnson said it's dead on arrival. I think if the Democrats were to somehow win the presidency and both and all of Congress in November, I think there could be some hope there. But I mean, it would likely have to be a constitutional amendment. I know he's calling on Congress to pass maybe a bill, but I think it would ultimately be brought before the Supreme Court. If it were just a bill, who would then make the decision? And given what they have been doing lately, I think it would be a pretty self-serving decision. And a constitutional amendment is a thing that we don't really have the consensus in this country to do. I do think that the part where the states vote, and I think we need 3/4 of the states to agree on an amendment, I think we might have that on this specific topic on term limits.
Okay.
It's really popular. It is really
popular. It's true.
Last poll I checked, which was a while ago, it was like 75%, I'm pretty sure, of people polled at least were in favor of term limits. But I don't know that it would get through Congress to make its way to the people for a vote. And we have
2/3 of each House of Congress before it even goes to the states.
Right. And we haven't done that since the 90s. So
we kind of forgot how to do this. Yeah. All right. Well, no, I'm glad you're optimistic. I am. I really like that it's happening, but I'm very skeptical about where we're going to be able to go with this. I think we need to keep on agitating and educating ourselves about exactly what we need to do here and how anti-democratic it is and how broken it is if you care about competence and efficiency even.
And how different it is from every other country that operates similarly to us. If you look outside the United States, we are so outdated and there isn't just one way to do this. And we think that this is it, but it's not.
It's just because it's what we came up with in 1787. Right. All right. Leeja Miller, thank you so much for coming. Hope to have you back again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Great. Thanks again to Leeja for joining us. And if you want to hear more from her, the place to do that especially is her YouTube channel. Make sure to go look up Leeja Miller on YouTube and subscribe. That's it for today's show. If you like what you're hearing, make sure to follow this podcast to automatically get downloads every week. Make sure to also listen to our special series called Decoding Project 2025, where we're going to be having more installments coming soon. And as always, make sure to follow me on Twitter, subscribe to the Substack at tristansnell.com, and we'll see you next Wednesday.